Almost no major outlet, not CNN, Fox News, or BBC, focused on what may be the most important development this week, and that absence itself tells you something about how modern information flows prioritize what is visible over what is decisive. While attention stayed fixed on the Strait of Hormuz blockade, on ship movements, on escalation rhetoric, and on Donald Trump's statements about eliminating Iranian fast attack boats, a far quieter but strategically more significant moment unfolded in Moscow, where Dmitry Peskov, speaking on behalf of Vladimir Putin, confirmed that Russia had already made an offer communicated to both the United States and regional actors, to remove Iran's enriched uranium from Iranian territory and place it under Russian custody as part of a broader peace framework. An offer that, as he emphasized, still stands but has not been acted upon. And it is precisely that lack of response, that silence from Washington, that may represent the most consequential signal in the entire conflict right now, because in diplomacy, silence is rarely passive. It is a deliberate choice, a calibrated posture, and often a message more revealing than any official statement, particularly when it occurs at a moment shaped by the February 28th U.S.-Israel strike campaign that targeted Iranian military infrastructure, leadership networks, and missile capabilities. An operation that triggered immediate Iranian retaliation through missile launches, drone attacks, and most critically, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but essential artery through which roughly 1/5 of global oil supply passes every day, setting off a chain reaction that has driven oil prices sharply upward, strained global supply chains, and placed enormous pressure on governments far beyond the region, while simultaneously creating the conditions for a fragile, time-limited ceasefire brokered through Pakistan, a ceasefire now approaching its expiration date of April 21st. And within that narrowing window, all negotiations have converged on a single unresolved issue that has defined not just this conflict, but years of U.S.-Iran tensions. What happens to Iran's enriched uranium, specifically the approximately 400 kilograms currently enriched to around 60% purity, a level that falls short of weapons grade but sits dangerously close to the threshold, meaning that, with existing centrifuge infrastructure, Iran could theoretically move from its current position to weapons-grade enrichment within weeks, if it chose to do so, which is why the United States has insisted on a maximalist position. Permanent removal of the stockpile, dismantling of enrichment infrastructure, and a long-term or indefinite end to Iran's ability to enrich uranium domestically. While Iran has countered with a far more limited offer centered on a temporary pause, reportedly around 5 years, after which it would resume enrichment under what it frames as its sovereign rights under international law, creating a gap that is not merely technical but fundamentally political and strategic, a gap that collapsed the most recent round of talks in Islamabad and was further widened when Trump publicly distanced himself from even the 20-year compromise proposed by his own negotiating team, signaling that the U.S. position may be shifting towards something even more absolute, a position that Iran's leadership may view as indistinguishable from total surrender. And it is precisely at this moment of deadlock that Russia's proposal enters the equation, not as a neutral gesture, but as a calculated intervention shaped by Moscow's own layered interests, economic, geopolitical, and strategic, because elevated oil prices directly benefit Russia's revenue streams, because acting as custodian of Iran's nuclear material would give Russia leverage over both Tehran and Washington simultaneously, and because inserting itself as an indispensable intermediary allows Russia to reassert global relevance in a high-stakes geopolitical crisis, effectively forcing the United States and its allies to engage with Moscow on terms that extend beyond the Middle East into broader issues like sanctions, Ukraine, and the structure of global power, meaning that Russia's proposal is not simply about uranium storage, but about reshaping the negotiation architecture itself, offering Iran a pathway to relocate rather than surrender its nuclear material, preserving domestic political legitimacy by avoiding the appearance of capitulation, while offering the United States a potential reduction in immediate proliferation risk, yet simultaneously embedding a long-term dependency on Russia as the holder of that material, which raises a fundamental question for Washington. Does transferring uranium to Russia meaningfully solve the problem the United States went to war to address? Or does it merely shift the location of risk while leaving the underlying capability intact, since Iran would still retain its centrifuges, its technical expertise, and the latent capacity to rebuild its stockpile over time? And it is this ambiguity that makes the current silence so critical, because not all silence is the same, and understanding its nature is key to interpreting what happens next, whether it is a thinking silence indicating active evaluation, a tactical silence designed to conceal negotiating positions, a bureaucratic silence reflecting internal disagreement within the U.S. administration, or a rejecting silence signaling that the offer has already been deemed insufficient but not publicly dismissed in order to keep diplomatic channels open. And while it is impossible from the outside to definitively determine which of these applies, the surrounding context provides clues, particularly the surge in diplomatic activity involving multiple actors, including Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, and Oman, all working in parallel to salvage a deal before the deadline, suggesting that negotiations are not dead, but instead exist in a highly compressed and unstable phase, where outcomes can shift rapidly and where the cost of failure is clearly defined, because if April 21st passes without an agreement or an extension of the ceasefire, several escalatory pathways open simultaneously. The United States regains full operational freedom to resume military strikes against Iranian targets. Iran faces internal and external pressure to respond more aggressively in the Strait of Hormuz, potentially deploying mines, anti-ship missiles, or asymmetric naval tactics. And global energy markets, which have shown tentative signs of stabilization based on expectations of a resolution, would likely react sharply, extending the economic impact of the conflict and disproportionately affecting regions already vulnerable to energy price shocks, meaning that the ceasefire is not simply a pause, but a structural constraint, holding back multiple layers of escalation. And its expiration would remove that constraint all at once, bringing the conflict into a more volatile phase, which is why Russia's proposal can be seen as either a bridge or a trap, depending on how it is interpreted. A bridge, in the sense that it removes the most immediate proliferation risk, provides political cover for both sides, and creates a framework for de-escalation, or a trap in the sense that it transfers strategic leverage to Russia, fails to address the deeper issue of Iran's enrichment capability, and potentially locks the United States into a position where it must rely on a geopolitical rival to manage a core security concern. And the most critical possibility, perhaps the one least visible but most consequential, is that the U.S. silence reflects not indecision, but a calculated recognition that Russia's offer does not meet its ultimate objective, which may not be temporary risk reduction, but permanent elimination of Iran's enrichment capacity. A goal that cannot be achieved through relocation alone, and that openly rejecting the proposal would collapse the remaining diplomatic framework at a moment when negotiators are still attempting to extract concessions through pressure and ambiguity, meaning that silence becomes a tool for buying time, maintaining leverage, and avoiding premature closure of options, even as the deadline approaches. And this is what makes the next 48 to 72 hours so important, not because of any single statement or event, but because the first clear signal from the United States, whether it comes in the form of acknowledgement, conditions, or outright rejection, will reveal the underlying strategic calculation that has so far remained hidden behind that silence. And once that signal appears, it will clarify whether the trajectory of this conflict leads toward a negotiated settlement, a temporary extension of the current ceasefire, or a return to open confrontation, because in this moment, more than any missile launch or naval movement, it is the absence of a response, the deliberate, sustained silence from Washington, that carries the greatest informational weight, serving not as a void, but as a compressed expression of unresolved tensions between stated objectives and political realities, between immediate risks and long-term strategy, and between the visible drama of war and the quieter, more decisive mechanics of diplomacy, where outcomes are often determined not by what is said loudly in public, but by what remains unsaid until the final moment when silence can no longer be maintained. And a choice, with all its consequences, must finally be made.